The sterile smell of bleach and the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors usually brought comfort to Dr. Elena Vance. But tonight the air felt heavy with a premonition of disaster. As the head of the emergency obstetrics unit, she had saved thousands of lives, yet nothing could prepare her for the moment the sliding doors burst open to reveal the man who had shattered her life 3 years ago. There stood Mark, his face pale with terror, clutching the hand of a woman writhing in pain on a gurney, the very woman he had left Elena for, when Elena was at her lowest point, grieving the loss of her own parents and struggling with a failing clinic. Mark didn't recognize Elena behind her surgical mask and cap. He only saw a doctor, a lifeline. But for Elena, the world slowed down as the past collided with a brutal present. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes rising to become the director of this prestigious hospital and the wife of a man who truly valued her. Yet in this flickering fluorescent light, she wasn't a powerful executive or a billionaire's wife. She was a surgeon faced with the ultimate test of professional ethics, saving the life of the child belonging to the man who had discarded her like trash. The chaos of the emergency room swirled around them as the nurses shouted vitals. The patient, Sarah, was barely 26 weeks pregnant, and the situation was dire. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady as she began the examination. She could hear Mark's frantic voice in the background, pleading with the staff, his tone filled with the same desperation he once used to promise Elena forever. It was a bitter irony that the woman who supplanted her was now dependent on her skill to survive. Elena focused on the ultrasound monitor, her eyes narrowing as she saw the restricted blood flow. The baby was in distress. Every second they delayed increased the risk of a fatal outcome. She signaled to the nursing team to prep the operating theater for an emergency C-section. She knew the risks were astronomical, and the chances of a 26-week-old infant surviving such a traumatic delivery were slim, but she had to try. This wasn't about revenge. It was about the oath she took. As they wheeled Sarah toward the OR, Mark tried to push past the double doors, his eyes bloodshot. A nurse held him back, but he caught Elena's gaze for a split second. There was no recognition, only a raw, primal fear. Elena turned away, her mind racing. 3 years ago, Mark had walked out on her when her family's business collapsed, and she was buried in debt. He had called her a burden and a joyless shell of a woman, moving in with Sarah just weeks after the divorce was finalized. He hadn't known that the struggling clinic Elena was trying to save was actually part of a larger medical conglomerate owned by the man who would later become her husband, Julian Thorne. He didn't know that she had ascended the corporate and medical ladder through sheer brilliance and resilience. To him, she was still the broken woman he left in a cold, empty apartment. Inside the operating room, the atmosphere was tense. Elena moved with clinical precision, her voice calm as she issued orders. The surgery was complicated by Sarah's underlying health issues, which Mark had clearly neglected to mention, or perhaps didn't even know. As Elena made the first incision, she felt a heavy weight of responsibility. She fought for hours, her brow drenched in sweat under the hot surgical lights. The baby was delivered, a tiny, fragile soul barely weighing 2 pounds. It wasn't breathing. Elena worked feverishly, performing neonatal resuscitation, her fingers performing a delicate dance on the infant's chest. For a moment there was a faint pulse, a flicker of hope, but the damage from the premature detachment of the placenta was too severe. Despite every advanced medical intervention available at the world-class facility, the monitors eventually flatlined. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena stood over the table, her breath hitching. She had done everything right. She had used the most advanced techniques, the most expensive equipment, and her own decades of expertise. But medicine has its limits, and nature can be cruel. As she stepped out of the OR to deliver the news, she saw Mark pacing the hallway. When he saw her approaching, he rushed forward, his face etched with a desperate hope that Elena was about to extinguish. She pulled down her mask, revealing her full face for the first time. The shock that registered on Mark's face was instantaneous. His jaw dropped. his eyes widening as he recognized the woman he had abandoned. But before he could utter her name, Elena spoke the words that every doctor dreads. "I'm so sorry, Mark. We did everything we could, but the baby didn't make it." The scream that tore from Mark's throat wasn't one of grief, but of sudden poisonous realization. He looked at her, his grief curdling into a dark, irrational rage. Mark's eyes shifted from shock to a burning, accusatory glare. The silence of the hallway was shattered by his heavy, ragged breathing. He took a step toward Elena, his fists clenched at his sides. The grief that should have been there was being rapidly replaced by a desperate need to find a scapegoat for the tragedy that had just unfolded. He looked at Elena not as the woman he had once promised to love, but as an enemy who had finally found a way to strike back. "You," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of malice and disbelief. "It was you. You were the doctor in there. You killed my son, didn't you? You saw us come in and you saw your chance to get even." Elena stood her ground, her face a mask of professional composure, despite the storm brewing in her chest. "Mark, calm down. This is a hospital. Sarah had a placental abruption. She was only 26 weeks along. We did everything humanly possible to save the child." But Mark wasn't listening. The logic of medicine meant nothing to a man blinded by guilt and the need to deflect his own failures. He began to shout, his voice echoing off the sterile walls, attracting the attention of nurses and security guards. "Don't give me that medical garbage. You hated me for leaving you. You were a bitter, broken woman when I walked out, and you've been waiting for this moment. You murdered my baby to hurt me." The accusations were so absurd that for a moment Elena couldn't even find the words to respond. She had spent years healing, building a life of luxury and influence with Julian, and dedicated her career to saving lives. The idea that she would violate her most sacred oath for a man as insignificant as Mark was laughable. Yet his screams were drawing a crowd. Hospital staff watched in horror as the man continued his tirade. "I'm going to sue you!" Mark screamed, his face turning a deep shade of purple. "I'm going to make sure you never pick up a scalpel again. You're a murderer, Elena. A cold-blooded killer, hiding behind a white coat." A security team arrived, stepping between Mark and the hospital director. Elena raised a hand to signal them to wait. She wanted to look him in the eye. "Mark, look at where you are," she said, her voice low and steady. "You are in the top-rated neonatal center in the country. If anyone could have saved that baby, it was the team in that room. Your anger is coming from grief, but do not mistake my silence for weakness. I am not the woman you left behind." Mark laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Oh, I see. You got a fancy promotion. You think you're someone now. You're still the same pathetic girl who couldn't even keep her own parents' clinic from going under. And now you've used your position to commit a crime." In his mind, it all made sense. In his mind, Elena was the villain of his story, because it was easier than admitting he had ignored Sarah's complaints of pain for 3 days because he didn't want to pay for a private checkup. He didn't want to admit that his own negligence had contributed to the emergency. He needed Elena to be the monster, so he could remain the victim. He turned to the onlookers, pointing a finger at Elena. "This woman is a fraud. She's the director. How much did you pay for that title? Did you sleep your way to the top just to have the power to kill the children of the people who saw you for who you really were?" The insults were personal and sharp, but Elena felt a strange sense of detachment. She looked at the man she once thought she couldn't live without and felt nothing but pity. He was small. He was a fragment of a past that no longer belonged to her. However, the professional stakes were high. An accusation of medical malpractice and intentional harm, even if baseless, could tarnish the hospital's reputation. "Take him to the waiting area," Elena ordered the security guards. "And call legal. We will handle this through the proper channels." As they dragged Mark away, he continued to howl about justice and revenge. his voice fading as the heavy doors closed behind him. Elena retreated to her office, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb. She sat behind her mahogany desk, looking out at the city skyline. Within minutes, her phone buzzed. It was Julian. "I heard there was an incident," he said, his voice a warm, grounding force. "Are you okay?" Elena sighed, leaning back. It was Mark Julian. He brought his new wife in. They lost the baby. Now he's accusing me of doing it on purpose. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Julian's voice turned cold, the tone of a man who protected what was his with ruthless efficiency. "I'll have my legal team at the hospital in 20 minutes. He has no idea who he's dealing with, does he?" Elena looked at a framed photo on her desk, her and Julian at the opening of the new wing. She wasn't just a doctor. She was the director of the Thorne Memorial Hospital, and her husband was a man whose influence reached into every corner of the city's power structure. Mark thought he was attacking a defenseless ex-wife. He didn't realize he had just declared war on a titan. But Mark was already on his phone, calling every tabloid and social justice blogger he knew, spinning a web of lies about a vengeful doctor and a stolen life. He was determined to burn her world down, unaware that he was standing in a field of gasoline with a single dying match. By the next morning, the local tabloids were already buzzing with the sensationalized headline, "Vengeful ex-wife or medical mishap director accused of infanticide." Mark had spent the entire night feeding lies to anyone who would listen. He portrayed himself as the grieving father, and Elena as a woman who had never moved, on a woman who had used her position of power to exact a gruesome revenge. He sat in a small coffee shop near the courthouse meeting with a low-grade lawyer he had hired with the last of his savings, convinced that a massive settlement was coming his way. He imagined Elena being stripped of her medical license, groveling at his feet for mercy. He was so consumed by his fantasy of her downfall that he didn't notice the sleek black sedans pulling up to the hospital, or the team of high-priced attorneys in tailored suits marching into the administration wing. Back at the hospital, Elena was in a board meeting. The atmosphere was thick with tension. While the board members respected her, the public relations nightmare Mark was creating was a serious concern. "Dr. Vance, we know these claims are baseless," one of the senior board members said, tapping a pen nervously. "But the optics are terrible. A former husband accusing the director of intentional malpractice. The media is having a field day. Perhaps it would be best if you took a temporary leave of absence until the internal investigation is complete." Elena looked around the room, her gaze steady. Before she could answer, the door swung open. Julian Thorne walked in his presence, immediately commanding the room's attention. He didn't say a word as he took a seat next to Elena, placing a protective hand over hers. "There will be no leave of absence," Julian said, his voice like velvet over steel. "My wife has saved more lives in this quarter than most surgeons do in a decade. We are not hiding. We are going to address this head-on." He turned to the hospital's head of legal. "I want the full medical records of the patient Sarah Miller pulled immediately. I want the security footage from the ER and the OR hallway, and I want a background check on Mark's financial situation over the last 3 years." Julian knew Mark better than Mark knew himself. He knew that men like Mark didn't act out of justice. They acted out of desperation. He suspected that Mark's new life with Sarah wasn't as glamorous as he tried to make it seem on social media. Meanwhile, Mark was at a local news station preparing for a live interview. He had dressed in a rumpled shirt to look like a man destroyed by grief. "She looked me in the eye," Mark told the reporter, his voice cracking on cue. "She knew that baby was mine and she let him die. She told me she'd make me regret leaving her, and this was her way of doing it. She's a monster." The interview aired at noon, and for a few hours the internet was a storm of outrage directed at Elena. People who had never met her were calling for her arrest. Mark felt a surge of triumph. He felt powerful for the first time since he had abandoned Elena. He thought he had won. He didn't realize that while he was playing with matches, Elena and Julian were moving the entire ocean to extinguish him. Inside the hospital's record room, Elena and her lead investigator were reviewing Sarah's prenatal history. What they found was shocking. Sarah had been diagnosed with high-risk preeclampsia weeks ago, but the records showed she had missed her last 4 appointments. There were notes from a different clinic where a doctor had warned that the baby was at extreme risk if she didn't begin immediate bed rest and medication. Elena realized that Mark hadn't just been negligent. He had likely been the reason Sarah didn't get care. He was avoiding the bills, Elena whispered, looking at the unpaid balances from the previous clinic. He knew she was sick and he did nothing because he couldn't afford the copay. The evidence was starting to paint a very different picture. It wasn't a story of a vengeful doctor, but a story of a man who had neglected his pregnant partner and was now trying to blame the one person who had tried to fix his mess. Elena felt a surge of cold anger. It was one thing to attack her reputation, but to use the death of his own child to cover up his financial selfishness was a level of depravity she hadn't expected, even from him. She called Julian. "I have everything we need. He didn't just lie about me. He lied about Sarah's care. He's responsible for the delay that led to the child's death." Julian's response was immediate. "The trap is set, Elena. He thinks he's coming for a settlement meeting this evening. He thinks he's going to walk away with millions. Let him come. We'll have the cameras rolling, but they won't be the ones he's expecting." That afternoon, Mark received a call from the hospital's legal department, inviting him to a private mediation to discuss his claims. Mark smirked at his lawyer. "See, they're scared. They're going to pay us to go away. I told you she'd break." He spent the rest of the afternoon looking at luxury car listings, already spending the money he hadn't yet received. He had no idea that the mediation was actually a stage for his own public dismantling. When Mark arrived at the hospital's executive boardroom that evening, he was strutting. He walked in with his lawyer, expecting to see a room full of cowed executives ready to sign a check. Instead, he saw Elena sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Julian and 3 of the most feared malpractice and criminal defense attorneys in the state. On the wall was a large projector screen, showing a timeline of Sarah's missed medical appointments and the outstanding debts Mark had accumulated. The air in the room felt freezing. Mark's smile faltered, his bravado flickering for a second, before he tried to regain his footing. "I hope you have the check ready," he blustered, "because my story is only getting louder." Elena looked at him, her expression one of pure clinical observation. "Sit down, Mark," she said quietly. "We have a lot to talk about." Mark pulled out a chair, his movements jerky and filled with a false sense of confidence. He tossed a folder onto the table, leaning back with a smug grin. "My lawyer has prepared the terms. $10 million for the loss of my son and the emotional trauma caused by your intentional negligence. If you sign tonight, I might consider telling the press it was just a misunderstanding. If not, I'm going to make sure your face is on every news outlet in the country as the doctor who kills babies for sport." Julian didn't even look at the folder. He signaled to one of his assistants and the projector screen flickered to life. "Let's talk about the truth instead, Mark," Julian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. The screen displayed a series of bank statements and credit card bills. "You've been drowning in debt for the last 18 months. You lost your job at the firm 3 months after you left Elena. You've been living off Sarah's meager earnings while telling her you were investing in a new startup. But the truth is, you were gambling. Thousands of dollars lost at the tables while Sarah's medical insurance lapsed because you stopped paying the premiums." Mark's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. That has nothing to do with this. My personal finances aren't the issue here. Actually, they are the heart of the issue." Elena interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest. She clicked a remote and Sarah's medical records appeared. Sarah was diagnosed with severe preeclampsia 6 weeks ago. The doctor at the community clinic told her she needed a specialist, but you told her the clinic was trying to scam her and that she was fine. You didn't want to pay the specialist's fees because you had already spent that month's rent at a casino. You ignored her swelling. You ignored her headaches, and you ignored the fact that she was dying right in front of you. Mark stammered, looking at his lawyer, but the lawyer was busy staring at the evidence on the screen, his expression one of growing horror. "You told me she was healthy until she got to the hospital," the lawyer whispered to Mark. "She was," Mark yelled, slamming his hand on the table. "Elena is making this up. She's the director. She can fake these records." "These records come from the city health database, Mark. They are time-stamped and encrypted," Elena said, leaning forward. "And here is the security footage from the ER waiting room the night you brought her in." The video played, showing Mark pacing the room, not in grief, but looking at his phone, appearing more annoyed than concerned. It showed him arguing with a nurse about the processing fee, while his wife was literally collapsing in the background. "You waited 45 minutes to check her in, because you were trying to find a way to avoid the admission deposit. By the time I saw her, the placenta had already detached. Your greed and your negligence killed that child long before I ever stepped into that operating room." The room went silent. The weight of the evidence was suffocating. Mark looked like a trapped animal, his eyes darting toward the door. The narrative he had built, the grieving father versus the vengeful ex, was disintegrating. Even if I was late," Mark stammered, his voice losing its edge. "You still hated me. You still had a motive. You can't prove you didn't let him die on purpose." Julian stood up, walking slowly around the table until he was standing directly behind Mark. He leaned down, his presence like a dark cloud. "We don't have to prove a negative, Mark, but we can prove a conspiracy to commit fraud. You've been soliciting donations on a crowdfunding site for legal fees to fight the killer doctor. You've raised $50,000 in the last 12 hours based on a lie. That is a federal crime." Julian placed a stack of documents in front of Mark. "This isn't a settlement agreement. This is a confession. You will sign this stating that you lied about Dr. Vance's conduct. You will admit that Sarah's lack of prenatal care was due to your own decisions. You will return every penny of that donated money. And in exchange, I might decide not to have you arrested for fraud and defamation tonight." Mark looked at the papers, his hands shaking. He looked at Elena, searching for a spark of the woman who used to cry when he raised his voice, the woman who would have done anything to make him happy. But that woman was gone. In her place was a titan of industry and medicine who looked at him with nothing but clinical disgust. "You think you're so high and mighty," Mark spat, though there were tears of frustration in his eyes. "You just want to see me crawl." "I don't care enough about you to want to see you crawl, Mark," Elena said. "I just want you gone. You are a parasite. You were a parasite when we were married. And you are a parasite now. Sign the papers and get out of my hospital. If I ever see your face again, or if Sarah's name or mine ever leaves your mouth in a public forum, Julian will make sure the rest of your life is spent in a prison cell." Mark grabbed the pen. His lawyer tried to stop him, realizing his own reputation was now on the line, but Mark pushed him away. He scribbled his name on the documents, his signature a jagged, ugly scrawl. He threw the pen down and stood up, trying to reclaim some shred of dignity. "I hope you're happy, Elena. You got your revenge." Elena didn't blink. "This isn't revenge, Mark. This is just the consequence of your own actions. Something you should have learned a long time ago." Mark turned and bolted from the room, his lawyer trailing behind him, leaving the atmosphere of the boardroom feeling suddenly lighter, as if a poison had been purged. The aftermath of the confrontation in the boardroom left a heavy silence that seemed to vibrate with the intensity of what had just occurred. Julian remained standing, his hand resting on the back of Elena's chair, a silent anchor in the storm. Elena took a deep breath, the scent of expensive cologne and old paper grounding her. She looked at the signed confession, a document that represented the absolute destruction of Mark's lies, yet she felt no joy. There was only a profound sense of relief that the truth was finally anchored in ink. Mark had fled like a coward, but the damage he had done to the hospital's reputation still lingered in the digital ether. Julian looked down at her, his eyes softening. "It's over, Elena. The legal team is already sending the signed confession to the news outlets that carried his interview. By tomorrow morning, the narrative will flip. But Elena wasn't just thinking about the headlines. She was thinking about Sarah. While Mark was a villain in this story, Sarah was a victim not just of medical circumstances, but of a man who had manipulated and neglected her. "I need to check on her," Elena said, standing up. Julian nodded, understanding her need for closure as a physician. "I'll handle the press release. Take your time." Elena walked through the quiet corridors of the executive wing and back toward the intensive care unit. The hospital at night always felt different. The shadows were longer, and the stakes felt more intimate. As she reached the ICU, she saw Sarah through the glass partition. The woman looked frail, her skin a ghostly pale against the white sheets, tubes, and wires connecting her to a life she was barely clinging to. Elena entered the room quietly. The nurse on duty looked up and nodded respectfully, knowing that the director had a personal stake in this case. Elena picked up the chart, reviewing the latest vitals. Sarah was stable but weak. She had survived the surgery, but the emotional and physical toll of the last 24 hours was immense. As Elena adjusted the IV drip, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. They were filled with a clouded, drug-induced haze, but as they focused on Elena, a flash of recognition sparked. She didn't see the killer doctor Mark had described. She saw the woman who had fought for her in the operating room when everything was falling apart. Is the baby?" Sarah's voice was a mere whisper, cracked and dry. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, taking the woman's hand. It was cold and trembling. Elena had delivered this news 1,000 times, but it never got easier. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. We did everything we could, but he was too small and his heart was too weak." Tears began to track down Sarah's face, disappearing into the pillow. She didn't scream like Mark had. She didn't point fingers. She simply closed her eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath of pure, unadulterated grief. "Mark told me. He told me it was your fault," Sarah whispered. Elena squeezed her hand gently. "Mark was angry, Sarah. But the truth is, your body was under a lot of stress. You had preeclampsia that wasn't treated in time." Sarah opened her eyes again, and this time they were clearer. I told him I didn't feel right weeks ago. He said we couldn't afford the doctor. He said I was just being dramatic to get out of housework." The admission was heartbreaking. It confirmed everything Julian's investigators had found. Sarah wasn't an accomplice to Mark's greed. She was another person he had used and discarded in his own way. Elena felt a surge of protectiveness toward the woman. "You're safe now," Elena said firmly. "You're going to stay here until you're fully recovered. You don't have to worry about the bills. This hospital and my family will take care of everything." Sarah looked confused, her brow furrowing. "Why? After what Mark said about you, why would you help me?" Elena looked out the window at the city lights. "Because I know what it's like to be under his thumb. I know what it's like to believe his lies because you want to believe in love. But you have a life ahead of you, Sarah. A life that doesn't include him." As Elena left the room, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The revenge Mark accused her of wasn't her style. Her true revenge was living a life so full and successful that he became a ghost and helping the very person he tried to use as a weapon against her. She walked toward the elevators, ready to go home, to the life she had built with Julian. But as the elevator doors opened, she was met by a barrage of camera flashes. The news of the confession had leaked faster than expected. Reporters were crowded in the lobby, held back by a line of security. Elena didn't shrink back. She stepped out into the lobby, her head held high. She didn't need a mask or a surgical cap now. She was Dr. Elena Vance Thorne, and she was the master of this domain. One reporter shouted above the rest, "Dr. Vance, did Mark Miller sign a confession admitting he lied? Is it true he neglected his wife's medical care?" Elena paused at the edge of the security line. She looked directly into the lens of the lead camera. "The truth is in the legal record," she said calmly. "But tonight isn't about a man's lies. It's about the importance of maternal health and the dangers of ignoring medical advice. My hospital remains committed to the highest standards of care, regardless of the personal history involved." She walked past them, her stride confident. Julian was waiting in the car outside the door held open by a driver. As she slid into the back seat, he took her hand and kissed her knuckles. "The lead story on every channel is the fall of Mark Miller," Julian said with a smirk. "He tried to ruin you, and instead he's become the most hated man in the city. The crowdfunding site has already frozen his account and is cooperating with the police for a fraud investigation." Elena leaned her head on Julian's shoulder, watching the hospital disappear in the rearview mirror. The battle was won, but she knew that for people like Mark, the story never ended quietly. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were most dangerous when they had nothing left to lose. The following morning, the world felt different. The headlines were no longer attacking Elena. They were dissecting Mark's history of deception. Public sympathy had swung violently in her favor, but Mark was nowhere to be found. He had vanished from his rented apartment, leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills and a shattered reputation. Elena arrived at the hospital early, her focus shifting back to her patients. She was in the middle of a staff briefing when her assistant interrupted, looking pale. "Dr. Vance, the police are here. They need to speak with you regarding Mark Miller." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Had he done something even more desperate? She stepped into her office to find two detectives waiting. "We tracked Mark's vehicle to the outskirts of the city," one detective explained. "But more importantly, we found evidence that he was attempting to access Sarah's medical records through a hacked portal last night. He's obsessed with finding a loophole to invalidate that confession." Elena realized that Mark wasn't just hiding, he was hunting. He couldn't accept that he was the villain, so he was trying to rewrite the ending of the story. She immediately ordered a lockdown on all digital patient files and increased security around Sarah's rotary wing. She knew Mark's pattern. He would lash out at the weakest point. If he couldn't hurt Elena professionally, he would try to hurt her by targeting those under her care. Julian, hearing the news, sent a private security detail to shadow Elena around the clock. The hospital, once a sanctuary of healing, now felt like a fortress under siege. Elena walked the halls, her eyes scanning every face, wondering if Mark was hiding in plain sight. She knew his ego was bruised, and a bruised ego in a man like Mark was a lethal weapon. By mid-afternoon, a package arrived at the hospital's reception desk, addressed to Elena. It was an unmarked box with no return address. Security intercepted it and ran it through the X-ray scanner. It wasn't a bomb, but what was inside was equally chilling, a collection of old photographs from their marriage, all of Elena's faces cut out with surgical precision. It was a message of psychological warfare. Mark was telling her that he was close, that he was watching, and that he still felt he owned a piece of her life. Elena looked at the mangled photos and felt a flash of the old fear, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard anger. She was no longer the victim of his gaslighting. She was the one in control. She handed the box back to the detectives. "Find him," she said, her voice like ice. "He's not just a fraud anymore. He's a stalker." While the police searched for Mark, Elena spent time with Sarah. The younger woman was getting stronger, but her spirit was broken. She confessed to Elena that Mark had taken her life savings, promising to invest it in a family future that never existed. "He made me feel like I was the lucky one," Sarah sobbed. "He told me you were a cold, career-obsessed woman who never cared about family. I believed him because I wanted to believe him." Elena listened, offering no judgment. She saw her younger self in Sarah's eyes, the version of her that hadn't yet realized that some people are black holes consuming everything and everyone around them. Elena promised Sarah that Julian's legal team would help her regear what she could, and that she would have a job at the hospital once she was healthy. As the sun began to set, the hospital's tension reached a breaking point. A fire alarm was pulled in the north wing, causing a massive surge of people toward the exits. In the confusion, Elena saw a figure in a white lab coat, moving against the flow of the crowd, heading toward the ICU, where Sarah was being kept. The man's gait was familiar, too fast, too aggressive. It was Mark. He had stolen a uniform and was using the chaos he created to get to his final target. Elena didn't wait for security. She knew the layout of the hospital better than anyone. She took the service stairs, her heart thumping in her ears, arriving at the ICU just as Mark was reaching for the handle of Sarah's door. "Stop right there, Mark!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the hallway. Mark turned, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. In his hand he held a syringe he had snatched from a prep cart. "You think you've won everything, don't you?" he screamed, ignoring the nurses who were ducking for cover. "You took my money, my reputation, and now you're taking her. She's mine. Everything is mine." He moved toward Elena, the syringe held like a knife. "If I can't have my life back, I'll make sure you never have yours either." Elena didn't flinch. She stood her ground as the hospital's elite security team rounded the corner, their weapons drawn, but not fired, fearing for Elena's safety. Mark was cornered, but this time there was no boardroom table to hide behind. He was a man at the end of his rope, and he was staring into the abyss of his own making. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Elena looked at the man she once loved and felt a profound sense of closure. He was no longer a monster to her. He was just a pathetic, broken man who had run out of lies. "It's over, Mark," she said softly. "Look at yourself. You're not a victim. You're just a coward." The words seemed to deflate him. The syringe slipped from his fingers, clattering on the linoleum floor. Security moved in instantly, tackling him to the ground. As they handcuffed him and dragged him away, Mark didn't scream or fight. He just stared at Elena with a look of pure, hollow defeat. He had tried to burn her world down, but he was the only one left in the ashes. The arrest of Mark Miller, in the heart of the hospital he tried to desecrate, sent a shockwave through the city. As the police led him out in handcuffs, the news cameras still lingering from the morning's scandal captured his fall in high definition. This time there was no sympathetic lighting or rehearsed grief. There was only a man caught in a stolen uniform, exposed as a stalker and a fraud. Elena stood at the hospital entrance, watching the flashing blue and red lights fade into the distance. Julian arrived moments later, stepping out of his car and wrapping his coat around her shoulders. He didn't ask if she was okay. He could see the steel in her eyes. "He's going away for a long time," Julian said quietly. "Between the fraud, the defamation, the hospital breach, and the attempted assault, he won't be a threat to anyone, ever again." Elena leaned into him, the adrenaline finally beginning to subside. The internal investigation had already cleared her of any wrongdoing, and the board of directors had issued a formal apology for ever doubting her integrity. But for Elena, the victory wasn't about the title or the prestige. It was about the fact that she had faced her past and didn't let it break her a second time. She went back inside to check on Sarah, who had been shielded from the chaos by the nursing staff. Sarah was awake, her face pale, but her eyes filled with a new kind of resolve. "He's gone, isn't he?" Sarah asked. Elena nodded. "He can't hurt you anymore. My legal team will ensure you have a restraining order and that your finances are untangled from his mess. You have a fresh start, Sarah. Don't waste it." In the weeks that followed, the hospital returned to its usual rhythm, though Elena's reputation had reached legendary status. She wasn't just a director. She was a symbol of resilience. The story of the doctor who saved the life of her enemy's wife only to be accused of murder and then vindicated became a national sensation. Elena used the platform to advocate for better prenatal care for underprivileged women, establishing the Elena Vance Foundation within the hospital. She poured her energy into ensuring that no other woman would suffer because of a partner's negligence or financial control. Julian supported her every step of the way, his resources amplifying her impact. They were no longer just a power couple. They were a force for change in the medical community. Meanwhile, Mark's life in the legal system was a slow-motion car crash. Without Elena to blame, he turned on his court-appointed lawyers, claiming a vast conspiracy was working against him. His parents, who had long since distanced themselves from his erratic behavior, refused to post bail. He sat in a cell watching the very news programs he had once tried to manipulate and now reporting on the opening of the new maternal health wing, named after the woman he had called pathetic. Every time he saw Elena's face on the screen, radiant, successful, and loved, it was a sharper sting than any prison sentence. He realized too late that Elena hadn't taken anything from him. He had thrown it all away the moment he decided that his ego was more important than the truth. Sarah's recovery was a slow process, but she became a regular fixture at the hospital's volunteer center. She wanted to give back to the place that had saved her life when her world was at its darkest. She often met with Elena for coffee, and a strange, unexpected friendship bloomed between the two women who had been linked by the same toxic man. They didn't talk about Mark often, but when they did, it was with the detached curiosity one might have for a distant natural disaster. They were servers, and they recognized that strength in each other. Sarah began studying for a nursing degree, her tuition quietly covered by a scholarship fund that Elena had established. It was the ultimate closure, turning a tragedy into a legacy of healing. As the first anniversary of the incident approached, the hospital held a gala to celebrate the success of the new maternal wing. Elena stood on the stage, the spotlight catching the diamonds around her neck, a gift from Julian for her birthday. She looked out at the audience, seeing doctors, donors, and even Sarah, who was smiling from a table near the front. Elena spoke about the importance of integrity, not just in medicine, but in life. "We are often defined by the choices we make when we are at our lowest," she told the crowd. "But we are truly shaped by how we treat those who have wronged us when we finally reach the top." The applause was deafening, a testament to a woman who had won not through revenge, but through excellence. Julian met her at the side of the stage, taking her hand as she stepped down. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Elena looked back at the hospital, the building glowing like a beacon in the night. She thought about the night Mark had burst through those doors, thinking he could destroy her. She realized then that he had actually done her a favor. He had forced her to see exactly how strong she had become. He had tried to bring her back to the darkness of their past, but all he had succeeded in doing was highlighting the brilliance of her future. "Yes," she said, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "I'm ready." They walked out to the car, leaving the ghosts of the past behind them, for good. The legacy of that night lived on in the lives Elena saved every day. The hospital became a gold standard for maternal care, and Elena was eventually invited to speak at international conferences about medical ethics and leadership. She never mentioned Mark by name in her speeches. He didn't deserve even that much of her breath. To her, he was just a case study in the consequences of a life built on lies. Her life was fulfilled with a husband who adored her, a career that fulfilled her, and the knowledge that she had turned a moment of potential ruin into a lifetime of triumph. The woman Mark had abandoned was long gone, and the woman who remained was unstoppable. The legal proceedings against Mark Miller dragged on for months, each hearing peeling back another layer of his deception. It was revealed that he had not only defrauded the public through his fake legal fund, but had also embezzled money from a small construction firm he had briefly worked for, under a false name. The successful businessman persona he had tried to project to the media was a house of cards held together by unpaid loans and stolen identities. In the courtroom, Elena sat in the front row, not out of a desire for vengeance, but to ensure that the truth was never obscured again. She watched as Mark tried to feign a mental breakdown to avoid sentencing, only for the court-appointed psychologist to declare him a classic narcissist, fully aware of his actions and motivated entirely by self-interest. The judge, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach, sentenced him to 15 years in a high-security facility, citing the extreme emotional cruelty and the physical danger he had posed to the hospital staff and patients. As Mark was led away, he tried one last time to catch Elena's eye, perhaps hoping for a flicker of pity or a sign that he still held some power over her emotions. But Elena was already looking at her phone, coordinating an emergency transport for a high-risk pregnancy arriving from a rural clinic. He was a footnote in her schedule, a closed file in the cabinet of her life. The doors of the courtroom swung shut behind him, marking the final time his name would ever be spoken in a context that mattered to her. Outside, the sun was shining on the courthouse steps, and Julian was waiting for her with a bouquet of lilies, her favorite. "It's finally done," he said, pulling her into a warm embrace. Elena breathed in the fresh air, feeling lighter than she had in years. The weight of the past had finally evaporated, leaving behind only the solid ground of her present reality. With Mark behind bars, Sarah's transformation accelerated. She moved into a small sunlit apartment near the university, her life finally free from the shadows of manipulation. She and Elena began a tradition of having lunch once a month, a time they spent discussing Sarah's nursing exams and the latest medical breakthroughs rather than the man who had once nearly destroyed them both. Sarah had become a powerful advocate for the foundation, speaking to groups of women about the warning signs of financial and emotional abuse. She was no longer the frail girl on the gurney. She was a woman with a voice and a purpose. Elena watched her progress with a sense of pride, realizing that the most beautiful part of her success wasn't the title of director or the wealth she shared with Julian, but the ability to lift others out of the same darkness she had once inhabited. At the hospital, the Vance Thorne maternal wing had become a sanctuary. Elena had implemented a revolutionary, holistic care model, where patients weren't just treated for their physical symptoms, but were also given access to legal and financial counseling if they were in vulnerable situations. She knew that health didn't exist in a vacuum, and that many of the complications she saw in the ER were the results of stresses that happened outside the hospital walls. Her innovative approach earned her the Doctor of the Year award from the National Medical Association. During the ceremony, she dedicated the award to the survivors who found their strength in the silence. It was a subtle nod to the journey she and Sarah had taken, a message that resonated with thousands of people watching the live broadcast. Julian, meanwhile, had used his influence to clear any remaining smear campaigns that had lingered on the internet from Mark's initial lies. He worked with tech companies to ensure that when someone searched for Dr. Elena Vance, they didn't see the tabloid headlines from that one chaotic night, but rather her contributions to science and her leadership in the medical field. He was her fiercest protector, but he also knew when to step back and let her shine. Their marriage was built on a foundation of mutual respect that Mark could never have understood. On their 5th anniversary, Julian surprised Elena by endowing a permanent research chair in her name at the medical school where she had once struggled to pay her tuition. It was a full-circle moment that brought Elena to tears, a reminder of how far she had come from the girl who thought her life was over when her first marriage collapsed. As the years passed, the story of the vengeful doctor faded into a legend of justice. Elena's life became a tapestry of high-stakes surgeries, successful policy changes, and quiet evenings at home with Julian. She had learned that the best way to handle a person who wants to see you fail is to succeed so spectacularly that their opinion becomes irrelevant. She had turned a moment of profound trauma into a lifelong mission, and in doing so, she had found a peace that no amount of money or status could provide. She was a healer, a leader and a wife, but most importantly, she was a woman who had reclaimed her own narrative. The sterile smell of bleach in the hospital corridors no longer reminded her of fear. It reminded her of the clean slate she had worked so hard to earn. The years rolled by like a steady tide, washing away the remaining grit of the scandal, until it was nothing more than a polished stone in the foundation of Elena's career. By the time she reached her mid-40s, Dr. Elena Vance Thorne was no longer just a local hospital director. She had been appointed as a special advisor to the World Health Organization on maternal mortality. Her face graced the covers of prestigious medical journals, not for the drama of her past, but for the groundbreaking protocol she had established to protect high-risk mothers in developing nations. She traveled the world from the gleaming skyscrapers of Dubai to the remote villages of Southeast Asia, implementing the same holistic care model that had started in her own hospital. Every time she stepped onto a podium, She carried the quiet authority of someone who had stared into the heart of a storm and refused to blink. In the quiet moments between her global responsibilities, Elena found her greatest joy in the simple, grounded reality of her life with Julian. They had built a home that was a sanctuary of art books and laughter, a stark contrast to the cold, tension-filled apartment she had shared with Mark. Julian had never stopped being her most ardent supporter. When she was tired, he was her rest. When she was frustrated by the bureaucracy of international medicine, he was her strategist. Their love was not the frantic, needy passion of youth, but a deep, resonant harmony that grew stronger with every passing year. They had adopted 2 children, a brother and sister from a local orphanage, and Elena made sure they grew up, knowing that their worth was inherent, never dependent on the approval of others. Watching them play in the garden, she often thought of the life she almost lost to a man who tried to convince her she was nothing. Sarah, too, had flourished in a way that seemed almost miraculous. She had graduated at the top of her nursing class and was now the lead neonatal nurse in Elena's wing. She had a special touch with the mothers who came in under duress, a way of speaking to them that made them feel seen and safe. She had married a kind, soft-spoken architect who adored her, and they were expecting their first child, a pregnancy that Elena personally monitored with a level of care that went beyond the professional. When Sarah finally gave birth to a healthy, screaming baby girl in the very same room where she had once faced her darkest hour, the circle was finally complete. As Elena held the newborn for the first time, she felt a profound sense of peace. The pain of the past had been replaced by the weight of a new life, a tangible proof that healing was always possible if one had the courage to choose it. Mark's name eventually vanished from the headlines and the gossip columns. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of the prison where he served his time. He tried multiple times to file for early parole, but each request was denied based on his lack of remorse and his continued attempts to blame others for his incarceration. He remained stuck in a loop of his own making, a man frozen in time while the world moved on without him. He had no visitors and no letters. He had burned every bridge he ever walked across, and now he was stranded on a tiny island of his own ego. The power he once thought he held over Elena had long since withered into nothingness. He was not the villain of her story anymore. He was barely a footnote. Elena's legacy was firmly established, not just in the buildings that bore her name, but in the lives of the women she had empowered. She started a mentorship program for young female surgeons, teaching them that technical skill was only half the battle, that they needed the emotional resilience to navigate a world that would often try to diminish them. She shared her story with them, not as a victim but as a victor. She showed them that a setback is often just a setup for a comeback, and that the only person who can truly define your value is you. Her vengeful reputation had long ago transformed into a reputation for unwavering justice. She was the doctor who fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves, the woman who turned a betrayal into a bridge for others to cross. As she stood on the balcony of her home one evening, looking out at the city lights, Julian stepped out to join her, handing her a glass of wine. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, pulling her close. Elena smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I was just thinking about how different life is when you stop waiting for the other shoe to drop," she replied. "For a long time, I thought I was defined by the people who left me. Now I realize I'm defined by the people who stayed, and the people I've been able to help stay." She looked up at the stars, feeling the cool night air. The sterile smell of the hospital was miles away, but the sense of purpose it gave her was always present. She was Dr. Elena Vance Thorne, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. The years of hard work and the weight of justice finally culminated in a grand ceremony at the city's most prestigious auditorium. Elena was being honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award for her contributions to medical ethics and maternal health. As she walked toward the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted for minutes. In the front row, Julian watched her with a pride that transcended words, and beside him sat Sarah, holding her young daughter's hand. Elena stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of the people who had become her true family. She didn't have a prepared speech. She spoke from the heart. She talked about how a life is not measured by its tragedies but by its transformations. She looked at the young medical students in the back of the room and told them that their greatest tool wasn't a scalpel but their integrity. Behind the scenes, the final chapter of Mark Miller's story had already been written. He had been released on a technicality after serving 12 years, but the world he entered was one that had no place for him. He was a man with no skills, no friends, and a name that was synonymous with a decade-old scandal. He tried to look for Elena one last time, driven by a lingering obsession. But he found that she was unreachable not because of security, but because she moved in a sphere of existence he couldn't even fathom. He ended up working a menial job under an alias in a different state, a shadow of the man who once thought he could rule through manipulation. He lived in a small, cramped room, haunted by the images of the woman he had discarded, who was now a beacon of hope for millions. His life was the ultimate silence, a void where his ego used to be. Elena, however, was busier than ever. She had officially retired from her role as hospital director, handing the reins over to a capable successor she had mentored for a decade. But she didn't stop working. She spent her days traveling to underserved communities, setting up mobile clinics that provided the same world-class care she had championed in the city. She was often found sitting on a wooden bench in a rural village, holding the hand of a nervous, expectant mother, explaining the procedure just as she had done for Sarah years ago. She had found her greatest fulfillment in these quiet moments of connection. The wealth and the titles were secondary to the simple act of saving a life and ensuring a mother could hold her child. One evening, after a long day at a rural clinic, Elena and Julian sat on the porch of a small cabin they had bought in the mountains. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the distant call of a bird. Julian turned to her and asked, "If you could go back to that night in the ER knowing everything that would happen, would you change anything?" Elena thought about it for a long moment. She thought about the pain, the betrayal, and the loss of the child that still sat, like a heavy shadow in a corner of her heart. "I wouldn't change the outcome for that baby," she said softly, "but I wouldn't change the path I had to walk. It made me the woman who could save all the ones that came after." Her story had become a legend, a modern parable of a woman who was pushed to the brink and chose to fly instead of fall. She had turned the worst moment of her life into a catalyst for a global movement. She had proven that no matter how much someone tries to erase you, your truth is a flame that cannot be extinguished. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet, Elena felt a sense of completion. She had lived a life of consequence, a life of honor, and a life of love. The woman who had been left behind in the dark was gone, and in her place was a light that would shine for generations to come. The legacy of Dr. Elena Vance Thorne was not written in stone, but in the heartbeats of the thousands of children who were born safely under her watch. It was written in the confidence of the women she had mentored and the lives she had restored. She was a reminder that the world can be a cruel place, but it is also a place where a single person's resilience can change the course of history. As she closed her eyes, listening to the peaceful silence of the mountains, she knew that she had finally found what she was looking for all those years ago, a home within herself that no one could ever take away. This story of resilience and justice shows that truth always finds its way to the light. If you enjoyed this journey of strength and transformation, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. Thank you for watching.